Welcome back to the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. continues to say things that require fact-checking. That includes his statements about autism. He says autism is, quote, an epidemic and, quote, a preventable disease. And he says he's launching a sweeping study that will pinpoint the, quote, environmental factors leading to a rise in autism rates. The Centers for Disease Control estimates 1 in every 31 children has autism. Now, that number has been steadily rising. For comparison, in the year 2000, 1 in 50 kids was diagnosed with the condition. But health experts say that increase is largely due to things like better screenings. The definition of autism has also broadened to include a variety of neurodivergent conditions known as autism spectrum disorders. RFK Jr.'s claims mirror a larger problem. There are persistent misconceptions about autism that affect autistic people and the way the world interacts with them. Recently, a Detroit autistic teen was allegedly shot in the back after he got lost on the east side. Fox 2 reported he was on the phone with his sister, who told him to take a photo of a nearby address. She says a man came out of the house yelling at her brother, who was panicked and confused. He was then allegedly jumped and shot. Police are investigating the case, so we can't draw definitive conclusions from it yet. But the need to better understand what life is like for autistic people and how to interact with them is vital. To discuss all of this, Colleen Allen joins us in the studio. She's the founder of the Henry Ford Center for Autism and Developmental Disabilities. Today, she leads the Autism Alliance of Michigan. Colleen, welcome to the Metro.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
So first, let's break it down for folks if we could. What is autism and what are autism spectrum disorders?
Sure. Autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder, and it is defined by deficits or limitations in areas of socialization, communication, and behavior. And in that behavior realm, I would also include sensory challenges, either being oversensitive to environmental input or in some cases seeking that input. Flashing lights can be a draw for some and a real distraction and problem for others. So it is a spectrum, and right around 2013, 2013, is when that definition was really broadened. And so for years, we were working with classic autism, which are those individuals that present with significant behaviors and the more profoundly affected. We also included something called PDD, sort of in the middle, has some of those symptoms. And then Asperger's, which was really common to lay persons, that really highly intellectual person who, is mostly independent, high intelligence. And that changed. And what we've adopted since then is what's called the autism spectrum. It's the full breadth of that individual with highest support needs all the way up to people who can live independently and hold degrees and jobs. And so that broadened definition has led to an increased number, in addition to just understanding, identifying, and diagnosing more frequently and earlier.
Could you talk more about how our understanding of autism has evolved over the years?
Mm-hmm. It's really evolved, and I would say for the most part in very good ways. The awareness of autism has really led to more services, especially for children. We have a full autism service market. There are still demand and wait list, but that understanding, I think, has also led to more acceptance and inclusion I was just reviewing before I came in, there's sensory-friendly theaters now. We train police officers, although we have a long way to go in that realm. But really, I think in terms of what our community has done to respond to people that present with challenges in these different areas is really we've made some nice progress.
And when you talk about that progress, I realize that's especially a reason why some autism advocates are worried when it comes to Health Secretary RFK Jr. Now, he's really sounding the alarm on autism. He says it's a, quote, epidemic, and he wants to create an autism registry. Here he is speaking last week.
This is a preventable disease. We know it's an environmental exposure. It has to be. Genes do not cause epidemics. They can provide a vulnerability. You need an environmental toxin.
Okay, the health secretary is saying a lot of things. That autism, first, is preventable, and that the stark rise is mostly caused by, quote, environmental toxins. Colleen, first, is autism at all preventable?
No, autism is not preventable. We can reduce the symptoms and improve outcomes, especially for the youngest children when identified earlier, so that a child who can look more severely affected at age 2 with the right interventions, in some cases can go on to secure a high school degree and a job. But it is not preventable. And we have decades of research. If it were preventable, we would be preventing autism. The only thing that we can really say about known cause right now is that there is a genetic basis to it. Now, there's a great deal of research around environmental or non-genetic causes. There's research around the father's age, for example, and prematurity, and none of those are conclusive studies at this point. Those are sort of the external, sort of the other factors beyond earlier, better diagnosis, awareness, and the other factors I mentioned early. But to claim it's an epidemic that is contagious, that, you can sort of catch it, is not accurate.
So in other words, if we totally cleaned up our air and our water, and if fathers had children when they were younger, there's no indication that there would be fewer cases of autism.
There may. Those studies are just inconclusive, is what I'm saying. I certainly would not discourage ongoing research to be looking at environmental factors. It's just that is not the only reason contributing to the increased numbers. And to make statements to claim that that's the direction and that is the sole direction for research, that I would say doesn't make sense, at least from my perspective.
Colleen, there are a lot more cases, a lot more diagnoses of people with autism now than there were 2 decades ago. So what would be your explanation for the rise?
Mm-hmm. I think it's a number of things. I mentioned, just better awareness and identification. And I always sort of point to, if you think about a child who is now diagnosed at the age of 2, where in prior years we really weren't picking up that segment of the population until they entered school, you've now included that many more persons, children, into those numbers. The other factor is we have more adults that are coming forward and disclosing that they have autism. I think that sort of the identity culture has allowed people to embrace autism. We know there's a number of self-advocates who wear autism proudly on their sleeve. And so that sort of normalizing the acceptance and the diagnosis has also contributed to our numbers. It also makes counting autism very difficult. It's hard to know how many adults are out there that haven't disclosed or aren't diagnosed yet because we don't have a lot of experts in the adult service areas.
Would you almost say, is it potentially a positive to have more diagnoses then, because it raises awareness and it also allows people to get more of the services and support that they need?
Yes and no. I think where interventions, autism-specific interventions, make sense for an individual diagnosed with autism, absolutely. Finding people and getting them connected to what they need as early as possible is really critical. I also think that in some cases, there is a degree of misdiagnosis and overdiagnosis. Some people are diagnosing themselves through, pretty standard Google search. And yeah, that sounds like me. I must have autism. But there are clear-cut diagnostic criteria. And when evaluated by a highly qualified diagnostician, autism is a true disorder under the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is sort of the Bible for psychiatric disorders. So certainly if it means access to the right services, but just services for the sake of getting services, it has to be the right approach.
This is the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. We're talking about how to better understand autism amid Health Secretary RFK Jr.'s claims about it. Our guest is Colleen Allen. She leads the Autism Alliance of Michigan. Colleen, at the same time that RFK Jr. is trying to highlight autism, some researchers say the Trump administration is cutting funding to autism research. One scientist at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill said behind the scenes, they're taking a hammer to the whole apparatus for autism research. Are you aware of research cuts for autism?
Well, some of our most prominent research and academic institutions are being cut funding. Many of those conduct autism research. So certainly we're going to see some challenges there. I think, for a lot of diseases, we're seeing setbacks and will in the near and far future by cutting funding for our research institutions. I also find it very interesting that, we have a health secretary that is claiming autism is priority and, at the same time, cutting funding, that very funding that supports interventions that produce the best outcomes. So it's not logical to me. But, I think there's a lot out there in terms of misinformation and misunderstood information. And I hope individuals with autism will look to us as a source of credible information. We are a professional organization, and we want to steer families to really good services and supports.
And again, that's the Autism Alliance of Michigan. But speaking of misinformation, one more point I'd like to discuss about RFK Jr. It's no secret he's long been a vaccine skeptic, and we know one of the big fears in the vaccine skeptical community is that vaccines cause autism. And I want to be clear that there is no evidence of that, and that the one study that tried to link that was retracted many years ago. But there are people who still cite this flawed research. Colleen, this has me wondering if RFK Jr. is trying to imply here that vaccines could be a cause. What do you think about that?
It is setting us back. When I stepped into this position years ago, we were helping families. We were trying to help our community understand that there wasn't a connection back then. And now, all these years later, we're having that same argument with that much more research that has documented no connection between those two. But, like a lot of communities and like a lot of conditions where we don't know cause and we don't have cures, it's not unusual to, really connect with your peers and your tribe, the people that are in it with you. And, it's pretty powerful when your neighbor whose child benefited from a service, or, their child had a regression and they really believed it was connected to that vaccine at 18 months or 2 years, to be a really powerful influence on that mom who doesn't really understand what she's seeing in her child. And so, there's very much the connecting to those who are in it with you, other moms, other dads, your coworker, whatever that looks like, which is why pulling people back to good information is really important and really, really hard to break through, because that support is it's so critical for families.
Colleen Allen is the founder of the Henry Ford Center for Autism and Developmental Disabilities. Today, she leads the Autism Alliance of Michigan. Colleen, thank you so much for joining the Metro.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Coming up, in a nearly unanimous vote, Michigan lawmakers in the state House passed a $115 million annual public safety fund aimed to decrease violent crime in communities. We'll hear from one of the groups that would benefit from that money. That's coming up next here on the Metro. Stay with us.